On Friday, July 18th, you had a unique situation. The Trump administration formally announced that the United States will be rejecting a certain World Health Organization agreement. Specifically, this was a global agreement that would have granted the WHO certain powers over America in the case of another pandemic. Although at that point you might be asking yourself, hold on, Roman, why would we have to do this? I mean, on Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order saying that the U.S. will leave the WHO altogether. So why do we have to reject certain agreements coming from the WHO? Well, the reason for that is indeed rather interesting, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the formal announcement came in the form of a joint statement that was made by RFK Jr. in his capacity as the health secretary, as well as Marco Rubio in his capacity as Secretary of State. Here's part of what RFK Jr. said. Quote, "Nations who accept the new regulations are signing over their power in health emergencies to an unelected international organization that could order lockdowns, travel restrictions, or any other measures that it sees fit. In fact, it doesn't even need to declare an emergency." Now, the backstory here is indeed quite interesting, and it really does show you the direct impact that a single election can have. Because you see, the changes in question that the WHO made were actually pushed forward by the prior administration. Up until the year 2025, the US government was actually the lead proponent of the changes that the WHO made. Now, we covered it extensively on our program as it was happening, but basically, when Joe Biden was in the White House during that 4-year-long period, his administration was working closely with the WHO to create a global pandemic treaty. For instance, back in September of 2022, you had the former U.S. Health Secretary, Mr. Javier Becerra. He issued a joint statement alongside the director of the WHO announcing what they refer to as the U.S.-WHO Strategic Dialogue. And in that statement, the goal of this strategic dialogue was stated to be, among other things, the following, quote, "To develop a platform to maximize the long-standing U.S.-WHO partnership and to protect and promote the health of all people around the globe, including the American people, as well as to develop a new pandemic instrument." Now, what exactly the new pandemic instrument is that they're discussing here, well, that began to take shape shortly after the statement was made. That's because you fast forward from the statement roughly 6 months, and on February 1st of 2023, these UN-US discussions spawned something called the Zero Draft of a Pandemic Treaty. You can see it up on your screen. Now, notably, this was just a draft, but it gives you an idea of what they were discussing and what they were trying to work towards. The zero draft version of that treaty would have given massive amounts of power to the UN through the WHO. For instance, under the subsection titled "The World Together Equitably," the zero draft document would grant the WHO the power to declare and to manage a global pandemic emergency. In practice, what that would look like, according to the text of that zero draft document, is that once a health emergency was declared by the WHO, all the signatories to the agreement, which would naturally include the United States, they would submit themselves in one shape, form, or other to the WHO regarding things like the treatment for the emergency, the government regulations, such as lockdowns as well as vaccine mandates. The WHO would take control of the global supply chains for those things, and they would have the authority to both monitor as well as surveil the populations of the different countries for safety and compliance reasons. Basically, if you remember back to the years of the pandemic, what was happening regionally in some countries in Europe and Asia and some states in the United States, where some enacted vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, vaccine tracking software, and so on, that would now all be done globally and managed by the WHO. Now, that was the zero draft version of the document. However, that particular zero draft version received so much pushback internationally that eventually many of its provisions were scrapped, and in its place, something a bit more watered down was actually enacted. Quote, "There was considerable resistance to these plans, especially from critics of the COVID-19 lockdowns recommended by the WHO. In the end, the idea of far-reaching restrictions on national sovereignty did not have majority support among the states. In response to this growing resistance, the new international health regulation reforms appear to be significantly weakened compared with the much criticized early drafts." And indeed, last year in August of 2024, the WHO passed these reforms with the United States, under the Biden administration, agreeing to comply with these new WHO amendments. And despite being watered down compared to the zero draft version of that document, it did introduce a new term. Quote, the amendments to the regulations included introducing a new term, a pandemic emergency, that would trigger certain actions to respond to a pandemic or events that could become a pandemic. The WHO said after they were approved in 2024 by member countries, including the United States, that the amendments would strengthen global preparedness, surveillance, and responses to public health emergencies, including pandemics. However, these new reforms to the amendments, they would leave ample room for interpretation. And so, according to the text, quote, the criteria for declaring a pandemic emergency include an infectious pathogenic threat with a wide geographical spread or risk of spread, the overload or threat of overloading health systems of affected states, etc. However, it is important to note that none of these conditions must exist or be demonstrable at the time of declaration. Rather, it is sufficient that there is a perceived risk of their occurrence. This gives the WHO Director General considerable scope for interpretation and is a reminder of how extensive restrictions on fundamental human rights were justified for more than 2 years in many countries during the COVID-19 response, pursued because of an abstract threat of imminent overloading of health systems, even at times of minimal transmission. Now, on the one hand, proponents of this amendment, which again used to include the United States government prior to the year 2025, they would say that this is a smart amendment, that the WHO, with all their technical knowledge, with their resources, their databases, as well as their ability to see real-time data from around the whole world, well, that should give them the authority to declare an emergency if they believe an emergency is imminent, since they have that vantage point. However, the idea of placing our national decision-making authority outside of the U.S. into the hands of people who are not even Americans was exactly one of the stated reasons that RFK Jr. gave when explaining the rationale for rejecting these amendments. Because you see, as I alluded to earlier at the top of the episode, this whole amendment process really does show the real-world effects that one election can have. Because on the one hand, you had the Biden administration playing an active role in shaping these new amendments. They literally got him across the finish line. However, as soon as Trump came back into the White House, on his very first day in office, he signed an executive order which literally withdrew the U.S. from the WHO in its entirety. Not just from the amendments, but from the WHO as a whole. However, because these amendments were already ratified, there was this kind of a strange situation that came about. Quote, there was a deadline this month to reject the amendments, or they would have become binding on the United States, even though the country withdrew from the WHO earlier this year. All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment, I'd like to introduce our sponsor and my own personal gold dealer, American Hartford Gold. Now, as soon as the latest round of tariffs hit, almost immediately, the stock market hit some serious waves, we could say. It became super turbulent, very volatile, and of course, these conditions don't just affect Wall Street. They affect all of us with our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I want to introduce a company that I trust and I use myself to help secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move their assets into something tangible, something you can actually hold, physical gold and physical silver. Two precious metals that help me sleep better at night, knowing that I have a hedge against all those brilliant decisions being made over in Washington. Now, they have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, they have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your doorstep, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive buy one, get one deal for my viewers. When you call them and mention my name, Roman, for every 1 ounce of gold that you purchase, you can get 1 ounce of free silver. And so take advantage of this special offer. Either call 866-242-2352 or simply text Roman to 65532. That's again, 866-242-2352 or text Roman to 65532. I'll also throw their information. It'll be down in the description box below. And so then this brings us neatly back to what happened last Friday. RFK Jr. and Marco Rubio, they released a joint statement, you can see it up on your screen, saying that the U.S. will not be complying with these new amendments. Now, besides weakening our national sovereignty and our national decision-making ability, the two, they also wrote the following as other reasons for why we are no longer going to be bound by these amendments. Quote, terminology throughout the 2024 amendments is vague and broad, risking WHO-coordinated international responses that focus on political issues like solidarity rather than rapid and effective actions. The amendments also suggest that countries develop capabilities that jeopardize management and dissemination controls over public health information, potentially stifling valuable scientific debate. Furthermore, these revisions compel countries to adopt digital health documents. Reminiscent of vaccine passports, there was also the Chinese component that they threw in here. Quote, developed without adequate public input, these amendments expand the role of the WHO in public health emergencies, create additional authorities for the WHO for shaping pandemic declarations, and promote WHO's ability to facilitate equitable access of health commodities. These amendments have undue influence on our domestic health responses from WHO directives. They also fail to adequately address the WHO's susceptibility to the political influence and censorship, most notably from China, during outbreaks. And so there you have it, the story of how the U.S. withdrew not only from the WHO, but also from the last remnants of the WHO that were set to go into effect. If you'd like to read either the full statement that came out of the Trump administration, or if you would like to read the actual full text of the WHO amendments as they're written, I'll throw all those links down into the description box below this video if you want to read them in their entirety. And also, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think that this is a good move and it's a direction towards more national sovereignty, or do you think that it will have a bad effect? In the case of a real pandemic sometime in the future, perhaps by not handing over our reins to the WHO, maybe the U.S. won't do as well. Although, is there really anything stopping the U.S. government from just looking at what the WHO is doing, taking their best practices and also listening to their good advice, even if we're not a chartered member? We could still just follow their advice of our own volition. I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave them in the comments section below. I'll be reading them tonight after the episode premieres and also well into the week. And then also, lastly, after you're done checking out those links and leaving those comments, if you would so like, smash that like button so that this video can reach ever more people. And then also, if you'd like to receive more episodes in your timeline every time we publish them, smash that subscribe button as well. That way you hopefully will be informed of any new episode as soon as we publish it. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.